Good morning, everybody. Yeah, it's very strange to be here because I'm nobody in the agile world. But I'll try to explain a little bit maybe why I'm giving this presentation rather than my colleagues. So 1 second. Uh, So I will cover quickly. I'll do a quick introduction about myself and share some stories about my past, and then like a few. Pete did a very good job to talk before explaining what is like original Agile and Scrum. But then I will later move on to uh, what actually happens when we try to implement Scrum in a multi-team environment, which is the case. Actually, from the beginning, software development required usually more than one team, but Scrum is silent about how to actually do this well. So that's why there are several frameworks, and I will be talking about the less framework. But so very briefly about who am I? So I started. So I spent 15 years in 10 years in public academia, and then about 3 years in industrial R&D. I am MRI physicist by training. So I used to do brain imaging. And I came to Singapore in 2004 to join NNI as a postdoctoral fellow. And then in 2007, I moved to Japan and I joined Philips Healthcare to continue doing this applied research on how to basically do translational clinical research on how to apply, let's say, new techniques which exist in research into clinical practice. And then I quit. I quit Philips, I quit science, and I moved back to Singapore, and I joined Hyperspace because it just opened. So, and I've always had this, at that time, this problem, who am I? Am I a physicist or neuroscientist or developer? I will explain why a physicist needs to know how to write software. Yeah, I'm definitely not a manager because when Philips, this is my latest name card from Philips Healthcare. Yeah, it's called Philips Electronics because it's a legal entity in Japan. And somebody in HR noticed that my business card did not say manager, but my pay grade was way above manager. So they added the manager to my name card. The HR lady came very happy, and I quit after 3 months because I'm not a manager. So when I quit everything and I came back to Singapore, basically I tried to enter I was deciding moving back to academia or doing something on my own. I've never done startups before, and 2010 was already the beginning of this, especially in Singapore. People wanted to emulate Silicon Valley. So this was the beginning of the startup. The Block 71 started maybe in 2000, around that time, 2011. So I more joined into this startup scene, and I tried to do my own two startup, which successfully failed. And I've learned a lot that the startup is probably harder than a PhD in physics. Now, this doesn't tell you anything about why am I talking to you about Agile. But I actually started reading about Agile development when the second book of Ken Beck came out, The Extreme Programming. I tried reading this in 2004 and it made absolutely no sense to me. But another thing I was reading are things like Scrums back then. There was not a lot of books or resources online, and the only one I found was the Scrum Primer. By the way, the previous speaker, Pete, didn't even mention that he was the original author. And this was actually my introduction to Scrum. And actually, the Scrum Primer is older than the official Scrum Guide from the Scrum.org organization. I think I made a mistake. First version must have appeared even before 2008, but it's around that time when I first read it. And what happened then, it's in one of the tech events, I met this other guy, other author of the Scrum Primer, whose name is Bas Modi. And he just gave a random talk. And then I realized, oh, I read the Scrum Primer and the guy lives in Singapore too. That's how I met Bas. And then later on, I knew about their company called OD, which I joined in between 2015 and 2016. That's not the whole team, but that's about like we have people in Singapore, Thailand, Japan, Australia, and now in Europe and the US. But we are a very small company, less than 30 people. But let me quickly talk to you about my previous life. So this is what I used to do 20 years ago, doing imaging of the brain and doing functional imaging of the brain, as well as doing some image processing. And you can imagine, especially the image processing part is not something they teach us if you major in physics. So all of this I had to learn by myself while doing my PhD. And that's because basically when we are in this kind of research, there are no tools that are available. So we cannot do this in Photoshop. Tools simply don't exist because we modify MRI scanner to acquire new kind of images, and nobody else knows how to actually do anything with this data. So that's the reason why I started learning programming. Actually, programming I started learning a bit earlier, but this was the first time when I had to create things like graphical user interface and everything which is needed, because I wasn't the only user of the software, but there were other students and there were other doctors who needed this software. And so I started writing code in about 95. This was actually paid experience. I was still in my third year university, and I was helping my professor to run his physics labs experiments. On the right, what you can see is my notes on my first, when I started PhD, end of 98. I didn't have a workstation. And then my advisor wanted to buy me a Sun workstation, which cost about 5 times of my PhD salary. I said, no, let's buy a Windows machine, and which costs only 1 salary, but I'll put Linux on it and I'll make everything work. So this was a bit, it wasn't as straightforward, but it actually eventually worked. I didn't spend too much time on recompiling the kernel so that the video card would work, which wasn't supported back then. The funny thing you might notice is that my first workstation doing this medical data stuff, I had 128 megabytes of RAM, and my hard drive was a 4 gigabyte drive. Well, back then it was an amazing machine. And I did like 3 years of PhD using this machine from 99 to 2002. And then I created finally. Now, I studied physics in Geneva, and you may have heard Geneva has this place called CERN, where they do this LHC thing. They're trying to create black holes. But it's also the home of where the web was, as we know today, was born by this guy called Berners-Lee. And what happened to me is during one of in 95, I actually worked at the CERN library, just handling the desk. And I met this guy before he became CERN. And while working at CERN, I learned HTML and CSS, and I created the first application for the CERN library to navigate, for people to find books. And it never occurred to me this was a big deal somehow. So this is just to say that, well, first of all, I'm pretty lucky to be born at the time I was born to be living in Switzerland, Geneva at that time, to have access to CERN, to be educated and even go all the way up to the PhD. I still had no idea how to apply my knowledge to how to apply this knowledge in a practical way. By practical, I mean how to make money out of it, because physicists don't make a lot of money in general. Another example I want to share, Audrey Tang, some of you may know, he's currently a minister without portfolio of Taiwan, or sometimes call him a digital minister. He's younger than me, but he is a very well-known person in the technical community because of his work with Perl and working with the communities in Taiwan and China. So he had figured out, I don't know if he has a PhD in anything, but basically he retired before he was 30 because he's made enough money consulting Apple. So PhD doesn't mean we know how to actually apply it. And science in general is this. I'm not trying to brag about anything. We are, I think, all unique regardless of our paths in life. And I wanted to share this lesson. It doesn't apply to us as individuals. It also applies to things like organizations. Like especially when we talk about Scrum or being Agile, every time we go into an organization to help them implement this, people say, yes, but our situation is so unique that this and this cannot. And that's how we get Scrum, but as Pete tried to explain. And it's both okay and not okay. We should recognize our uniqueness, but we also should recognize that there is also a lot of similarities that we need to be aware of. And it's not our uniqueness that both uniqueness and commonality are valuable, both at the individual level as well as the organizational level. Now, let me quickly move to Agile and Scrum part. So I won't talk at all about what basic Scrum is because Pete did a very good introduction. But I just want to point out one thing, which when I work with people, both technical and organizations, nobody seems to care about how is it that we are where we are today. Nobody likes to read history or think about it. And also this leads to some confusion about terminology and who came first and what's more important and who is the right person to read or because there's in our time internet, there's so much information, but without knowing a bit of history, we actually don't know how to filter good from bad things. Now, I just want to point out that the term Agile is actually pretty old. There's a book, Agile Manufacturing from 94. This time, Toyota was, and Toyota systems and other companies that were using what today is known as lean manufacturing. There were people coming up trying to translate from Japanese into English and giving it names. So Agile probably appeared. Agile in the sense of how can we be flexible with our organizations, whatever we do, hardware or like some traditional manufacturing. Scrum as a term, in the sense that we understand is to date, appeared first time in proceedings from Association for Computing Machinery, a conference called UPSLA, which is Object-Oriented Programming, Systems, Languages, and Architecture, I think. It's a conference which still exists today, but this was the first paper where Scrum was described as a development process. Now, the third thing is the Agile Manifesto, that as people call it. So the history is this was done in 2001, and this is in the Agile Manifesto website. It's very useful to read because it at least describes who were the original people behind the Agile Manifesto. A really good history of, so Scrum is what we would call a part of um, methodologies. The more general term, other than agile, but from technical perspective, is called iterative and incremental development. And this is something that basically started in the 30s. I mean, we didn't have the computers, but the very, very first time when people started to write software, like serious software, Project Mercury, this is before Project Apollo from NASA, they already started doing the iterative development, including practices that came later into extreme programming, like test-driven development. So these techniques exist, and this article is a very good historical overview of this. Today we would call agile. Now, another thing I wanted to point out, that actual title for the Agile Manifesto is Manifesto for Agile Software Development. It's not Agile Manifesto, and then it's Agile everything, Agile HR, Agile, I don't know, finance or whatever. It was specifically created by software development practitioners who were seeking ways to develop software in a better ways. Basically, it was a response to this heavy-duty waterfall process that was being imposed on this new emergent field, which is like industrial software engineering. I'm not saying that agile HR development or like initiatives like this is a bad idea, but it's good to know that originally this was done, like what we call today agile software development was focusing software development and software product development more specifically. I guess you could read this one by yourself. So where do we use agile? Agile works well in the what we call in anything which is like initial product idea development, which is a startup phase, or when we already start seeing any kind of market traction. So we already start building, we're already receiving probably money from investors. So we start to build it up and customize for specific. We already identified the market segment and maybe some customers already expressed interest. So we need to customize things, because as soon as people see a product, they say, yes, but can it also do this? Because we are so unique. And then finally, from customization, we start building and growing a product. And when the product matures, that's when usually we can still, of course, do agile, but there is always a fight between what do we call a risk hunger. So usually in a very stable products or services, we want to minimize our risk exposure. It's a little bit like think about if you do any kind of investment. So startup is like just go and buy Bitcoins or any kind of random stock, while product and service would be your bonds and your CPF level of investment, where we cannot afford losing any kind of money. Now, I don't want to talk about Scrum, but and Peter already mentioned about some obstacles of implementing Scrum. But I also share a few of this. When people come into Scrum and try to adopt this in an organization, there are some misconceptions. So first misconception to me is that companies like Facebook are very proud of saying things like move fast and break things. Okay. And people think that this is a good way of, like every startup should do this. And then one of the creator of Scrum, whose name is Jeff Sutherland, also published this book called The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time, which made every finance people happy and every developer very unhappy, because in a stakeholder's understanding, Scrum will allow us to get things faster and potentially cheaper. And this is a very, very dangerous idea. Why? Because like, if you want, well, first, okay, I'm using an analogy and maybe not the best one, because this kind of running is an individual game, while we're talking about software development, which is a team sport. But still, I'll try to explain my point. So there are different kinds of running. And usually a good runner who runs 100-meter sprints will probably never win a marathon. Now, when we do software product development, is it a sprint or is it a marathon? It depends. Actually, a product is not a project, as in like we don't have start and end date. As long as people continue using a product or service and keep paying money, the product lives. So actually software product development is more like a marathon. So the idea of how fast we should develop it is very different, and how we approach this development is very different from when we do our project-based development, where the only thing that counts is speed. Now, in different contexts, speed means risk. Like the faster I run, or the faster I run, if I trip over, I hurt or I can injure myself by, I don't know, doing some. Also, speed is only one component of velocity, and people really forget about this, because it doesn't matter how fast we go if the direction is wrong. And in product development, we have to always monitor both the speed and the direction, because we will just crash into a wall or run off a cliff. So we need to know how to reduce speed when it's needed, so that actually the product survives. Another very common misconception is that, we only need Scrum. Let's send a bunch of people to a Scrum training and adopt it. When I say we've adopted Scrum, means that a couple of people went to a 3-day training or 2-day training, and then the boss says, yep, Scrum from next Monday. And then after first sprint, they say, we are now Agile because we have adopted it. In the industry, this is called a lipstick Agile, which is basically a very shallow implementation or adoption of Scrum. Because, I mean, how hard can it be? A Scrum guide is like, you can read it in half an hour. How hard can it be? And it's, as Pete said, it's actually very hard. We say that Scrum is easy to understand and hard to master. And by the way, the U.S. Department of Defense wrote a couple of guides on how not to adopt how not to do bad Agile or Scrum. It's available online. Later, this will be shared, but you can also Google it by yourself. Another misconception about Scrum, I won't repeat too much, is the role of Scrum Master, because it's an unusual role in most organizations. And usually it's given to a junior person or to some project manager, because they think they can do Scrum. What the Scrum Master is just basically renaming the typo and say, now we have Scrum Masters. Okay, we're Agile. And that's very dangerous. And I think this is what's hurting the most, the adoption of Agile and Scrum, because it's not enough to rename the title. People actually need to know. You don't have to be a domain expert. You don't need to be a developer, but it's either you're coming from development background or you're coming from project management background, but it's good to have domain knowledge, so that you can at least speak the same language with the people working on the product in your domain. And of course, a Scrum Master is a master of Scrum. He understands all the nuances. The problem with the original Scrum guide and some books, is that Scrum is so simple, because it actually completely misses, it doesn't explain anything how to fill the holes which are working in your context. Scrum doesn't say how to do development. Scrum doesn't say how to actually run, let's say, a sprint planning. How much can we do, like estimation, or these are not Scrum techniques. Scrum says nothing about this. And also the Scrum is very bad at explaining what does it mean to be a product owner. Or actually, what does it mean to be a team, especially a self-organizing team. There's very little information in the Scrum guide that people still need to, whenever we have such a fuzzy terminology in the same organization, people will have different understanding. And they will attach different meaning to the word, and then they will start arguing about, this is this, but not this, and Scrum Master shouldn't be doing this. So this is where a lot of, I think, pain comes from. I think one of the best resources for fixing at least the Scrum Master part is go to scrummasterchecklist.org. It's a document created by Michael James, who is, I believe, #2 certified Scrum trainer from the Scrum Alliance. He lives in US. I believe he also does sometimes courses in Singapore. Especially after pandemic, he started doing virtual courses. And he's a good friend of our company and Buzz. Okay, let me now move to scaling part. And so my colleague Bas Mode and his friend Craig Larman, they've been working in large organizations, and they've tried to implement Scrum in this very huge context. When we say huge context, is let's say a telecom provider, like, I don't know, Ericsson or Nokia or AT&T. I'm not talking about Singtel. I mean, people building the hardware which Singtel will use so that it will connect your mobile phone. For example, so Bas was working with Nokia, and Nokia at the time already had more than 2,000 engineers building, and this was, I'm talking about not mobile phones, only the base stations that will connect mobile phones. Only the base station business, which is called Nokia Networks, already had like about 2,000 engineers trying to build a single product. But then because each country has different regulation, you need to customize the product and talk to Singtel and other operator in other countries. So that's why it requires so much people. And of course, if you have a main product and then customization, how is it the same product or not the same product? So they were facing this constant problems of like, how do we do Scrum, which looks so easy and yet it doesn't work. So they started working on this less framework, although it's never was called less. Less as a term became known only around 2016-ish when they published their third book. But I just wanted to highlight that unlike the Scrum Guide, they focused on a few areas which Scrum leaves, silent. And that's how the structure organization should look like. Some principles are similar to Scrum principles, but in larger context, how to actually do an adoption. Is there a difference between adopting Scrum and, let's say, 100 people organization versus 1,000 people organizations? And there is a difference. And also, what do we do with management? Like when people see, let's do Scrum, and then project managers say, yeah, but what happens to us? So less is more explicit about the role of management in organization, which is still important. We still need to manage that. It's just what we actually do changes, and we need to support everybody, not just developers. So you could see this is Craig and Bas, and so they wrote their first book on scaling in 2008, Scaling in an Agile. And 2 years later, they wrote a second book. Actually, the two books were written in parallel. First book is a bit more of the thinking tools and organizational design tools, like how to approach things. That's where the management practices or structure, or how many product owners do we need, depending on the size. And the second book, Practices of Scaling, is actually, it's their record of all the experiments they did in different organizations they were coaching. There are more than 800 experiments, which it described, okay, for the next 2 sprints, let's try this. And that's called an experiment. And they don't call it experiment, they call it try this practice. And we've tried it, it works. Try this practice, we've tried it, doesn't work, so avoid. So but the second book is maybe 600 pages, and people don't like reading, so nobody's reading this book. So that's why they wrote the Large Scale Scrum book, which is basically a prequel to the first 2 books, but the actual information is in the first 2 books. Well, It's good to start with the 2016 book if you want to go more, because it's a distilled version of it's already um, based on the feedback from people and whatnot. So this is what we call a very one view of what less is. So basically, it's a less of set of principles. There are two frameworks, which I'll explain quickly later. There are guides how to do certain things, like for example, avoid more than, let's say, more than one product owner per, I don't know, 8 teams. So one product owner can handle 8 teams, but not more. And then there are experiments, which are a collection of experiments. Because it's just like a Scrum guide, the less framework is adapted because we have more and more feedback from different companies and people doing this. I mean, it's less that it's less doesn't belong to OD. It's a completely separate entity, and there is a global community of people working on this and trying to implement this in various companies. So these are the less principles, which are slightly different from Scrum way of defining, how to say, principles, which are things that shouldn't change. But one of the big principles is large-scale Scrum is Scrum, which means all the Scrum principles are included. Therefore, we can add or emphasize some of the or explain in better details what do we actually want to do when we try to be less like organization. And less is very particular about the terminology. For example, what does it mean to be a team? Because it's such a vague term. Like a football team is 11 people. I don't know. If you fly, the air crew is another kind of team, but the development team or Scrum team we need to understand. When you say team, we need to be specific. Otherwise, again, we just get into problems of misunderstanding, and we are lost in translation. I mean, when two people talk to each other, even in English, same language, they are still lost in translation because the meaning of the word is different from us unless we agree on it. So we have to be very precise on what do we mean by the team? What do we mean by the product? What does it mean, definition of done? What does it mean to be actually done? So it actually can be gone to production and we know it's making money and we don't need to redo it. I don't want to go to all of the principles because it's easier to read them and it's not the purpose of this short presentation. But less is Scrum is just to say that Scrum is a barely sufficient methodology because it's so silent about the actual practices. It's hard to, but this lack of concreteness allows flexibility for the organizations to adapt it to their context. That's the power of Scrum. And less is the same, except that we are in a larger context, which means the complexity of work and human interaction is higher. So we need to be more precise with the language, as well as how do we know, like what is our control process? It's both Scrum and less are called the empirical process control methodology. We use evidence rather than somebody's opinion to drive our decisions how to move forward. So yeah, the one definition of less is Scrum applied to many teams working together on one product. And now the difficult part is how to define a product, which is just, it looks easy, but actually it's not. Like if you think about the Tesla, is Tesla one product as a car? Or is Tesla is half and then the autopilot is another product? Then we need to agree. Another important principle is systems thinking. And by systems thinking is less has a huge emphasis on try to see the big picture, because when we are used to work individually or in small groups, and then we try to isolate ourselves. And when we isolate ourselves, it's very easy to basically get get into the details and stop seeing the whole picture. Even though there is maybe a senior management who does have a big picture, this whole picture is not shared equally among everybody. And that can lead to certain problems. Again, I use the Agile HR manifesto, but I'm not saying it's bad. Is that one problem of first let's convert the whole of HR department and make it Agile. The problem is departments are already compartmentalized and they're specialized. And by saying that, we have Agile HR, which means HR doesn't need to work with legal because we're different departments. So it can create this artificial boundaries where people don't collaborate with each other. And by the way, if you have an organization with an existing structure, like you have HR, you have finance, you have the actual operations, whatever you're doing, maybe it's a hospital or maybe it's a software development or manufacturing. If you take one, if you convert each department separately, I don't know, by doing whatever framework you want to apply, and you have Agile HR and all the departments are Agile, it doesn't necessarily mean the whole organization will become Agile, because we are still partitioned, we are still siloed. And the whole purpose of Agile is to be flexible. Flexibility means remove barrier of internal collaboration. That's at least how I think about it. So these are some good books on what it means, what is system thinking and how to make changes in an organizations. Very quickly, so there are two LESS frameworks. One is called LESS or less basic, which works is, so Scrum is one team, so LESS is between 2 to 8 teams. So basically it's an organization of about less than 60 people who are actively involved in R&D or product development roles. So it's developers, it's business analysts. And by developer, I mean UX, UI experts or data science people. All this we just call developers. These are everybody who is needed to make a product. Now it's up to you to decide whether marketing people are in this or not. If they are, great. If not, you have work to do. And basically, LESS is just like Scrum, but applied to multiple teams. The main thing is that all teams use the same cadence, which means the sprint duration is the same for all teams. And of course, they are using Scrum or whatever their version of Scrum, depending on the level of maturity of knowledge of Scrum, how well they can know plannings and sprint reviews and retrospective. The only difference with original Scrum is there is one additional event called overall retrospective, where teams or representative of teams come together to discuss more system issues once per sprint. And that will generate some input to the maybe next sprint. And usually there is a lot of again, that there are no additional roles compared to Scrum, which means that there is no extra coordination role, for example. So there is still no managers, but there are Scrum masters who facilitate the whole process of working in multi-team environment. Less huge is basically how do we scale to a big organization, and the way this is done is basically a less basic has a product owner. In a less huge, we want to scale this area of about maybe 4 to 8 teams. And then this area is managed what we call by a specific product area. Let's say, and there is an area product owner who manages the area backlog. Like for example, in finance or let's say private banking, an area could be, let's say, people who develop software for relationship managers. So it's an internal product which helps manage relationship managers manage the customers. Or another area would be, we need that app for the actual clients. So that will be the direct customer. We need to build an app for people to see their accounts and maybe make investments. So they're completely different areas, but actually it's the same product. Both things need to exist for private banking to work. So the only difference compared to less basic is that we have a new role or Scrum, which is called area. And with area, there is an area product owner and an area backlog. And now we have a team of product owners. There is a main product owner who is not called chief product owner. He's just called the product owner. He's the main person who decides the investment into product development in different areas because he has the most knowledge about the market and the business. And then the people continue working. It's the same sprint for everybody. It's the same kind of events. Now, of course, still no project managers. Coordination is happening by the team themselves with the help of Scrum Masters. And as the team matures, they figure out how to do it by themselves. But there are practices that are much more explicit, which are available both in the books and on the website, which I won't talk much about this now. I just wanted to mention, so Scrum is, so software development is a team sport. And in Scrum, we're talking about cross-functional self-organizing team. In Less, we use what we call feature teams. And feature teams are cross-functional, functional in the sense that in each team, there is a tester, there is a front-end guy, there is a back-end developer. Whatever is needed in the team, this knowledge must exist somehow in the team. This is called cross-functional. Cross-component means all software is modularized, and they usually put into some components, like let's say a logging function or a fraud detection function or something like this. These would be called the components inside the software systems. And a feature team should be able to modify a large set of components. We don't want people to specialize in components. And the team is a stable, which means that the people who are, people don't jump in and out of a team every other sprint. So we want the stable team because that's when people, like in the military, a good unit are actually composed with people who know each other because they trust each other. And they can figure out their own problems by themselves. Long live this. We don't want to assemble and disband teams for whatever reasons. We have a working team. We know that people know how to do the work. We just give them work. Whatever the nature of the work, they will figure it out how to do it. We need to trust into these people's ability to acquire new knowledge, because we hire people not for their existing knowledge, but for their ability to learn new things. I won't go too much into details of structure and management, except to say that it's a sort of an inverted pyramid. Like we know traditional organizations has this CEO and then heads of departments and then the people at the bottom. We want to invert this to bring the actual people doing actual work closer to the users. We want to remove the layers of communications, and managers' role is to enable this kind of structure so it works. So the role of a manager changes in the sense that managers are usually senior people with more domain knowledge, with more expertise. They are there to help people acquire this knowledge if the knowledge doesn't exist. So that's the role of the management. Less is very specific on, or very explicit about the importance of technical practices. And because without technical practices, we cannot achieve agility. And by technical practices are actually things that are not taught in universities, like test-driven development or pair programming, or how to actually do test automation. All of this, or how to unit test. What does it mean, unit test? It's much more specific that this is a very important thing and that something that requires teaching and coaching. Learning resources, you can go to the less.works website. And I would just point out there is a One Team Scrum. This is the Scrum Primer, which keeps being updated sometimes. And it's also available in multiple translations in, I think now is 15 languages. Another useful learning resource on the website, other than, so Less website contains maybe 90% of what's in the books. So if you don't want to buy a book, you can read the most of it on the website. Another interesting resource on the website is the case studies. When people say in this specific industry, what had been done, did it work or not? Yeah, and if you want to do Agile, stop reading Agile books and start reading something about other things by important people like Demi. Reading book is not enough. We also need to teach how to do practical things. So I am one of the maintainer of Singapore craftsmanship meetup. So we do some regular coding sessions. There is another, probably more known in GovTech, run by Mike Chang, who's a good friend from Hackerspace. They are doing similar things for more junior people, but software doesn't mean we are, you haven't finished your computer science degree, you're not welcome. No, it's cool. Anybody is welcome to come to the practical sessions or when we organize specific events. Oh, that's it for me. Thank you very much for your, sorry for taking.
Okay, maybe just a very quick question. There's been a question to ask, are there examples of well-known companies or governments that have implemented less?
Nokia, Nokia has been implementing less for 15 years and still doing. It's an ongoing process. It's a misconception that, we are done implementing because the
It's always adapting.
It's a continuous improvement process.
Okay. Besides Nokia?
Besides Nokia, currently we are working with a bank, which is very serious about this. I know companies in Europe which are extremely successful. What's called Bysoft. They are doing software for all the printing machines in the world. Like Xerox is buying their software to run the printer. They are doing. It's more than 300 developers. They've been doing less for 6 years, and they're very happy.
Okay. Besides that, I think I've also seen that BMW is also using it and Huawei is also using it. Yeah. So I think that's about the time that we have almost. So basically, though Ivan has been very kind to say a lot of things are available on the website and so on, I think it takes a very rare, talented individual to just read and know how to implement it. So I have good news to say that Digital Academy will be bringing on board courses on LESS. So do watch out for it. We'll be adding them into the Digital Academy's website catalog over the next few weeks. And even, am I right that the training is suitable? There are different courses suitable for the team members, the product owners, and the Scrum Master?
Yes. So there are basically, we do two different kind of trainings. One is called Certified LESS Practitioner, which is a LESS theory, which is useful both for Scrum Masters and the product owner, as well as developers. And we have specific courses for actual development where we do a real LESS like development in 1 week.
Okay.
We don't have a specific course for product owners because we would just redirect this to Scrum Alliance or Scrum.org for people who want to learn more about specific things like product owner.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ivan. It was a great knowledge sharing by you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.